Welcome back, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed that film as much as I know the panelists have. I just want to introduce our two panelists and just say a couple of words about the video, about the recording of this event, just for clarification. So, first, let me just introduce our two panelists. We're very lucky to be joined by the producer of the film, Amy Ballard, who's a senior historic preservation specialist emerita from the Smithsonian Institution. She's in her career traveled to Russia several times under the auspices of the State Department and has met with students in St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, Vladivostok, and Khabarovsk about the public participation process for design projects at the Smithsonian. In addition to being a producer for this film, she's also coordinated the 2022 English language production and Chronicle of the Left Hand, an American Black family story from slavery to Russia's Hollywood by James Lloydovich Patterson. And also joining us today is Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon. She is a doctoral student in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work analyzes race, foreign policy, and culture in the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. And her writing has been featured in Al Jazeera English, Medusa, MSNBC, and the Kennan Institute's Russia File. A reminder to our audience during today's discussion, if you have a question for our speakers, please submit them via the Q&A function on our Zoom chat. I already have one in the queue. And please include your name and affiliation when sending your questions. So just a word about the film we just watched. When this event is back on our website for view on demand afterwards, it will not be including the video. It's undergoing a review for film festivals around the country, and so we cannot have something live recorded on our website while that process is underway. However, if you are interested in seeing this film, if you're watching this video after today's discussion, please just drop the Kennan Institute a line, and we'll connect you with Amy Ballard, and she will have information on which film festival to go to or other updates about the film. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over, I think, first to Kimberly. Kimberly, can you tell us a little bit about your reactions to this film and its importance?
Sure. Well, thank you, Kennan Institute, for having me, and thank you so much, Amy, for organizing the film, putting everything together. If I speak honestly, I cried the first time I saw the film. I cried the first time I met Mr. P, James Lloydovich Patterson, a couple of years ago. And it's really because I think this film just exudes love. It's perfect for the day before Valentine's Day. It's a love letter to him, but also you see how much he loves his family. And I think that's something that's so special about him. And when you meet him, he still exudes that love, and he really is the same kid from the movie Circus. But something that I love about the movie is that you see the long arc of his life and James Lloydovich Patterson's life. It connects both American history and Soviet history and post-Soviet Russian history. But most importantly, he's kind of like a Soviet, Forrest Gump. He is in this famous movie from 1936. And I remember the first time I saw The Circus when I was in Russian summer school, and I was just awed. I was like, where did they find this black child that they're lifting up? You see him. I'm like, where did he come from? And that was a question that kind of was in the back of my mind for years until I started doing more research about African Americans who went to the Soviet Union, and I found out about his father, Lloyd, and the 1932 film group that were going to make a film called Black and White about racism in the United States. And the film falls apart, but Lloyd stays, and he creates this Soviet American mixed race family that has transcended the era. It's surpassed the Soviet Union. But James Lloydovich Patterson's life, I really think, shows the interconnectedness between these two histories, but also it shows just how monumental the types of things people from the Soviet Union lived through during this time. The idea that Stalin knew who he was is kind of terrifying to me as as a person who works on Stalinism. But and also because he said I was the only dark-skinned person in the group. If we think of the thousands of people who marched in Soviet parades, how terrifying it would be to be the only person that looked different and to know Stalin knew who you were. And the way he tells it, he kind of gets a kick out of it but it's also following the purges in the 1930s. And I think as one of the attendees has said, the purges in the 1930s affected quite a few members who put on the movie Circus. I think the director, a few of the actors were purged. And if you talk to Mr. Patterson, you read a little bit more about it, he believes that his movie mom, Lubova Orlova, she protected him and his family during the purges because they were clearly connected to foreigners at a time when being connected to foreigners could mean, political and social death along with possible physical death in the Soviet Union. So he's connected to the purges. He's connected to this film, which is the high point of Soviet internationalism. His father dies in World War II, but also the idea that an African American died in World War II on behalf of the Soviets. That's a very unique connection. He's in 1957 at the Sixth World Congress of Youth and Students, and it was fascinating to me. I've never seen that footage of him walking with these African students. In 1957, this event, it's a watershed really for Africans in the Soviet Union. So it's fascinating to see him walking with Africans. It was also notable to me the way they talk about him. They describe him as living in Russia and going to school with Russians. But I'm like, he's Russian. Why would this be interesting? Why would they construct this way? So that gives us something to think about how they portray him as he's a Soviet, participant, but he's not himself personified as Soviet and as Russian, despite the fact he grew up in this country. And there's also the collapse and the heartbreak and just what happens when the social system that supported art and creativity in the humanities, it collapses and where he has to go. And luckily, he's able to come to the United States with his mother. But something that kind of always is sewn through his story, and I just want to highlight this, is he says, he wants his family to remain in history forever. And I think we kind of see the problem of effervescence when it comes to historical memory. And he has his books, he has his poetry, he has Cirque because of that film. He's part of history, but he really reinforces the historical moments of his family's history, going back to his grandmother, Margaret Glasgow. And I had no idea she was his grandmother. I had written about her, and then long afterwards, I realized that she was actually Lloyd Patterson, another person I wrote about, that she was his mom. And Lloyd is the reason why Margaret, his grandmother, goes to the Soviet Union. She's in search of work. So you get to see these really fascinating interconnections that culminate into the creation of James Lloydovich Patterson. But I really think that some of the saddest parts of the movie where he talks about remaining in history and he talks about kind of being the last one left, and that has so many meanings. He's the last one left from the film, he's the last one left from his family, and he's the last one left from this short but incredibly interesting history of African Americans going to the Soviet Union during Jim Crow in the 30s. And as he's reaching the twilight of his life, I think that I'm very happy that we're having this conversation, that we're having this film. But to me, it also reinforces the importance of those connections he talks about, being able to be connected to each other and be friends with each other. But moreover, the importance of memory and the importance of really keeping on with that love that he clearly has for his family and his history to kind of carry that love on and educate more people about it, which is something I hope to do with my research. But I also think that when we think about James Lloydovich Patterson, we have to also think about his mom, his mother. And I mean, he's clearly a mama's boy. It's so sweet how much when you meet him, he talks about his mom. But I would love to know more about Vera because she married and had children with a foreigner at a time where it wasn't very good for Soviet people to have those connections with foreigners. She was able to enjoy that connection before the turn against foreigners. And I think her story in and of itself is fascinating, but also so representative of the costs of World War II for Soviet women and what happens in that fallout. So I think when we think about James Lloydovich Patterson and his story, this isn't just Soviet history, it's Soviet history, and most importantly, it's American history. It's not just African American history, it's American history. His story and his life ties in all of these intricate connections between our two countries and this fascinating history that I really hope will remain in history forever. Thank you.
Kimberly, thanks so much for putting all of this into just so much a broader perspective that helps us understand what we just saw a lot better. I want to bring in Amy Ballard into this conversation now. And Amy, I want to hear about, the making of this film and the future of this film, where you plan to show it. But I also want to bring in your experience, past experience with the Smithsonian Institution. I was really struck by the sort of mental picture of you going through all of these files of his, these papers and pieces of art, and just what that must have been like, and how you were able to uh, find a proper and suitable home for those things so that they might live on. So I'm just going to turn it over to you to just tell us a bit about the journey to making this video a reality.
Okay. Well, first, Joe, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm just really happy to be here. And thank you all for watching the film. Well, I guess I should start off by telling you that my role as producer, I was only a helper, really. And so I wouldn't call myself a producer, but we couldn't think of what else to call me. And I want to tell you a little bit about the director. His name, Dmitry Klitschkov. He's in his early 30s. He was born in Leningrad to a family of musicians. His father is the concertmaster of the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. But Dima's career took a totally different turn, um, studying film. And he relocated to Estonia when the invasion of Ukraine happened, and that's where he is based now. And I've known Dima and his family for many years, and I told him about Mr. Patterson, as did his father and mother, and he was really taken by the whole story and by the film Circus. And he wanted to document Mr. Patterson's life. And I'd always wanted somebody to do this, but I just didn't know who. So Dima came to Washington in 2023 for about 10 days. And we went over to Mr. Patterson's every day and just filmed him. And as you can see, Mr. P was more comfortable, I think, talking in Russian, and Dima was the one that asked him all of the questions. He and I had gone over a couple of things, and I want to say that Dmitry is very happy that you all are watching his film today. And getting back to these papers, you just cannot believe these garbage bags full of things. And I would just take each bag, open it, and put everything out. There was no order, nothing. And my apartment was full of nothing but Mr. Patterson's papers, DVDs, VHS tapes. I mean, it was incredible. So it did take me several weeks to go through all of this. I went and got file folders, file boxes, and tried to make some order out of everything. And I realized that I really had a treasure trove here, and that eventually it deserved to be somewhere very special. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, where could all of this go? And somebody, I forget who, one of my friends mentioned the Schoenberg Center. And I thought, oh, so I looked it up and I got in contact with them. And the rest you heard, they accepted everything. I still have the papers. They're on their way. At some point, they will be collected and sent off. And as I mentioned, Vera's papers, such as they are, will also go there. So I'm just really, really thrilled about that.
Great. Were you finished, Amy?
I just want to give everybody a little update about Mr. Patterson.
Please do.
Okay. Well, I realized that he needed more care than he was receiving at his apartment. And during the summer of 2024, I arranged for him to become a long-term resident at a wonderful nursing home in Washington. And coincidentally, this was amazing. Mr. Patterson has a Russian doctor who oversees the care of the people at Carroll Manor. And he's very close with her, which is wonderful. And he participates in all of the activities there. The staff love him. He's met people, and I'm just really, really glad that he is a happy camper there. And people do come to visit, and I still take him out. So I would say that he's just doing great and in very good health.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I want to have our first question come from Dr. Amaryllis Lloydovich Patterson from Howard University,
Mhm.
and welcome to her students who are watching today. Amy, if you could say a little bit about your work with cultural diplomacy over the years, and you know your view on its importance and lasting impact, and Kimberly, she would like to know if you could talk a bit more about the complicated relationship between the African American citizens who went over to the Soviet Union and were engaged with the Soviet Union in various, um, not just political but also cultural efforts, like literature, film, and the movie Circus, for example. So those comments, Amy, please, I'll have you go first.
Oh gosh, well, I have to say I had the best time when I went to Russia on those trips. The students were really eager to learn about the public participation process that we go through for our design and construction projects. And I used as an example the National Museum of the American Indian because that's the one that I worked on the most. And they were fascinated by the involvement of the Native Americans and how they felt about the National Mall. And they were just really interested in everything. And I was so grateful for the opportunity. I do think that it's very, very important to have this cultural diplomacy. And it's just really unfortunate that it hasn't happened since the war in Ukraine. So I hope that it will return one of these days.
And Kimberly, your thoughts on Amaryllis's question.
Hello, Howard University students and of Dr. Lugo de Fabris, my closest crew of academic friends. So African Americans who had artistic and cultural connections with the Soviet Union, it's a long history, particularly before World War II. Unfortunately, what happens is quite a few of them, such as Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson, who had these closer ties in the 30s, they end up paying for that during anti-communism and McCarthyism in the 50s. Robeson lost his American passport for a while, but they are still actually celebrated in the Soviet Union and in East Germany until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of East Germany, and they're actually still well known by a lot of people in both countries. And so it's a complicated nature in terms of their connections because you can see that the time that people like Langston Hughes spent in the Soviet Union influenced their work and it influenced their insight on the possibilities of civil rights in the United States. But also, you have the situation where they influence the Soviet Union and they influence East Germany. So there kind of is a reciprocal influence there. But often we only talk about how they were influenced by the Eastern Bloc, but it was more reciprocal. And I can answer more questions about that later or in my writing, but that's a great question.
And that's a great answer, at least an answer to start. Amy, a question from Donald Schwartz from our audience. Was there any mention by Mr. Patterson during your many conversations about Stalin's terror, about what he experienced, about what his friends may have experienced? Just any comment at all on that?
Well, as you heard in the film, he does credit Luba or Orlova for I wouldn't say saving the family, but protecting them. And she, according to Mr. Patterson, went directly to Stalin and asked him to do this. So I suppose that's what happened. But he doesn't really talk about that part a lot. But that's the one thing that I do know.
Mhm.
And I've interviewed Mr. P
Mhm.
about these issues, but also I think so the film shows him when he's having really good days and he's able to talk for a
Mhm.
long time. Because of his age, he's almost like he's 92. It does take a little bit longer for him to
Mhm.
answer questions and for him to kind of process. And so we're talking about the 30s and 40s. I mean, he has gaps in his memory. These are things from over 70 years ago, but you can tell it is painful for him to kind of
Mhm.
refer to these events. But I think for most Soviet people who lived through that, they don't really talk about it.
And the other thing too that he has told me is that he was so fond of Solomon Michels, who
Mhm.
was in the film also towards the end. And he was really heartbroken when he found out what had happened to him, how he was murdered. And I was going through Mr. Patterson's books, and he has a book by Michal's daughter in Russian, and she wrote a beautiful inscription to him. So he is upset, and I think Kimberly said it really well. He just kind of prefers not to talk about it.
Fair enough. Uh, for our panel, a question from Sue Woolmans from our audience. Did Mr. Patterson come up against any racism in communist Russia, especially during his time in the Navy?
That's a good question, and I actually asked him about this, and he said no. But Kimberly, maybe you have some other thoughts.
We actually talked about this. I asked him about this when I was interviewing him a couple of years ago, and he said no. He said like but he when you talk to Mr. P, you can still see he's very Soviet in a lot of ways, and so he talked about there was the Brotherhood of the Peoples, and so people just didn't treat him differently than how they treated other people. And so I was fascinated by that because, I mean, if you read the press reports in the 60s, 70s, you expect there to be racism against people that look like him. So I think it's a combination of not only he's living in the Soviet Union in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's when he's becoming an adult. And that's a very different kind of attitude and Soviet dedication to anti-racism than what we would see later. But also, I think this is one of the benefits of the movie Cirque. I mean, how many people had seen the movie The Circus by the time he's 15 years old, 16 years old, and joining the Navy? Would they be openly confronting with him with racism when they know who he is? And if they know who he is, most likely other people know who he is, like Stalin or Khrushchev. So I think that is important as the celebrity part. It's the same thing with African Americans like Paul Robeson and Angela Davis who go to the Soviet Union. The celebrity is also a big part of why they don't necessarily experience racism. But yeah, he's very much like the friendship of the peoples and the brotherhood of the peoples. He said like he didn't experience any kind of racism.
Well, turning back to the Friendship of the Peoples, we have a question from Kathy Lewis from the Smithsonian Institution, who's wondering if there's any more material in Mr. Patterson's files about the 1957 World Youth Congress.
Well, Kathy, it's very nice to hear from you. And actually, that clip was found by Dimitri's friends in Russia. I had never seen it. I did not know about this Congress. I was fascinated. And Dima tried to find, other pictures of Mr. P in Africa, but we could find nothing. So uh, I have to be honest and say we don't know anything more than the clip you saw.
Okay, fair enough. We have a question from Jennifer Klybon from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, who also lived many years in Moscow, and was wondering if either of you have any comments about or knowledge of whether James was used for Soviet propaganda during his years, and if he had any thoughts about that.
I do remember that Mr. Patterson told me that the KGB had him come to meet with them, and they wanted him to go around with delegates from Africa and America when they came and tell them what was going on. And Mr. Patterson said no, he was not going to do it. And that's the only time that he's ever mentioned anything like that. Kimberly, do you have any thoughts about that?
It's actually kind of similar to, I mean, we saw it with the clip of the 1957 festival where he's surrounded by African students and they talk about him as being growing up in Russia, but not necessarily being Russian. So I think that's an interesting thing. I actually found a clip talking about him, and I think in Pravda or Izvestia, I was looking for like discussion of African women, and he happens to have a poem published, and they juxtapose, they put it on the same page, although it has nothing to do with it. They put James Lloydovich Patterson there to talk about his poetry. But what's interesting is that it seems like he's kind of rejecting these Soviet attempts to use him as a token of, so if the Družba Narodov with African people. And what's interesting is like, do we have a similar experience with Yelena Khanga, who's Black Russian, who's born later on, or her mother, who was actually the product of an African American man who went to the Soviet Union and a Russian woman. But I think he is very much I think it's not just necessarily not wanting to be tokenized. I think Mr. Patterson also understood the high stakes of being seen as political or being connected to politics. And just by his presence and his skin color, he's already seen as political. So I think in some ways, him saying, no, I don't want to do that is saying, I don't want to have to be connected to anything more politicized than I already am.
Okay. So I have two questions from the audience about the movie Circus. First, is there a way for the audience to stream Circus somewhere? And second, to the panelists' knowledge, is the movie still popular in Russia? Is it still being shown maybe on late night television? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
You can definitely watch the movie on YouTube. Mosfilm's entire film library is on YouTube, and I think they have subtitles. It's how I'm watching most of the films I talk about in my dissertation, is I can watch them, and most of them are past, I guess, what the licensing requirements like Circus, so you can watch it. And yeah, is there like a Turner Classic Movies in Russia where
I
they would watch the Circus?
I don't think so, Kimberly, but I've been trying to contact Turner Classic Movie and have them show this film with Mr. Patterson. And I don't really know if I'm writing to the right address or not, because Turner Classic Movies is Mr. P's favorite channel. He watches it all the time. And I just think it would be great if they would show this film.
Well, after that plug, how couldn't they? And so
Right?
I guess the Russians can still watch Circus on YouTube if it's not slowed down by the Putin government. Bradley Gorski from Georgetown University would like to touch back again on the 1957 Youth Festival and was wondering if the panel could talk a bit about the relationship between African Americans and the Soviet Union, including about anti-racism during the post-war period.
So the post-war period looks a little bit different in terms of the connections between African Americans and the Soviet Union. For me, the 1930s is really the high point of these connections. But you have multiple things happening that end those connections. You have the Soviet armoring of Italy when it invades Ethiopia, which turned a lot of African Americans away from supporting the Soviet Union in the 30s. You have the purges in 37 and the terror, which really closes the door on foreigners being in the Soviet Union. World War II, the earth-shattering event. But post-war, you still have some important connections in terms of African Americans using the presence of the Soviet Union in the United Nations and the Soviet claims of anti-racism to make claims on the American government and to push for African American equality and civil rights, including, I think there was shortly after World War II, there was a push by African American groups to have racism in the United States seen as a violation of human rights. And they were basing this on Soviet ideas and conceptions of human rights. So you still have those ideas and those connections happening, and African Americans were really good in the 50s and 60s, inclusive, of using the Cold War and the Soviet stance on anti-racism to make claims for equality and citizenship by the American government. And the United States has to respond because now it's in this Cold War. So it's a fascinating history that a lot of people don't know about. And I think the 57 Youth Festival is really important because it introduces the Soviet Union to Africans for the first time. They've seen them on TV, but now you have Africans there. And what I'm trying to figure out, it's a side quest. I want to see if any African Americans went to the 1957 festival because I know a group
Yeah.
of Americans went. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. That's a side quest, not part of the dissertation.
I have a couple more prosaic questions from the audience. First,
Mhm.
Elena Suhir is asking, does Mr. P have any family? Did he ever get married? Did he have kids? Apparently not. It probably would have been in the film. But any cousins in the US or Russia that stay in touch?
Yes, his youngest brother, Tom, died in the summer of 2023, and he is in touch with his wife. And Mr. Patterson also has very distant cousins, and they are in New York and in Virginia. But really, I would say that his friends are his I mean, they're his
Yeah.
nucleus, I guess you would say.
Okay. And another audience member was wondering whether his mother was Jewish.
No, she
Yeah.
was Russian. She was born in Venetia, Ukraine. Her father was the doctor there.
Mhm.
Um, she had, I believe, four or five brothers, and they lived around Moscow. And let's see, yes, and so nobody is left from her family either. I asked Mr. Patterson if he had any relations in Russia left from Vera's family, and he said no.
Okay.
Oh, and somebody asked about, yes, Mr. Patterson was married for a brief time to a teacher. Her name was Irina. Apparently, she's still alive. They haven't talked. She lives in Moscow. And when Vera and Mr. Patterson were thinking about moving to the States, uh, Irina didn't want to go. And so Mr. Patterson said, "Would you like to have a divorce?" And she said, "Yes." So he left her his apartment in Moscow.
Hmm.
That's about all I know about that. So,
Okay. We have a question from Imani Crawford from Black Bread, who was wondering about Mr. P's cultural adjustment to the United States. He clearly misses home quite a bit. Any Russian who leaves home will miss Russia. But what about like his chosen community in settling in the United States? Does he mainly hang out with other Russians who speak his language, or does he hang out with other African Americans? Where does he feel most comfortable?
I think with the both, but I would say mostly with the Russians. Every October, I take him to the bazaar at St. John's Russian or Orthodox Cathedral, and he just
Mhm.
loves that. He feels great there. But no, he feels very comfortable with other blacks. He likes everybody.
And when I visited him, so when it was before he moved to his new care facility. I mean, his apartment was in a predominantly black neighborhood, and so when I was there, his nurse was black. I met Mr. James, his best friend, was black, and he was very comfortable. It was funny because like we started speaking in Russian, and he kind of looked at me, and I was like, yeah, I can do this too. I can speak Russian. So it's this cool connection. But I do think it is interesting, and I tried to ask him about this, but I don't think he understood my question. But in terms of what does it mean to be Black Russian when you come to the United States, and we have a different understanding of race and nationality. And so he kind of didn't, he wasn't able to answer the question. But I think it is more seeing yourself as Russian because you were culturally and socially and grew up in Russia, and then entering this space where you are foreign, even if you may have the same skin color as like Black Americans. So that's kind of what I kind of got from it. But hopefully I'll be able to ask him again when he's like freshly woken up and he'll have a little bit more energy and we can get into it.
All right. Well, we have about 10 minutes remaining in our conversation today. So first of all, I'm going to pass along a suggestion from the audience, again from Jennifer Cliburn, who suggests that Peggy Seeger, a U.S. folk musician, went to the youth exhibit in '57. She interviewed this person several years ago about it. So hopefully Jennifer might be able to put you in touch. Please, if any of the audience members, including Jennifer or others, would like to be put in touch with any of the speakers, please write to the Kennan Institute and we'll facilitate that connection. And then finally, I would like to ask one of the audience members about Mr. Patterson's poetic association with Pushkin. He mentioned it in the film, but if you could just maybe draw out a little bit more of that, just how much of a hero, how much of an inspiration was Pushkin for Mr. P?
Well, I would say that Pushkin was the top. He has posters of Pushkin. He has many volumes of works by Pushkin. He was allowed to, there was a picture in the film. He was allowed to go to Pushkin's apartment and hold the death mask. He adores Pushkin. He went to Pushkin's grave. Anything associated with Pushkin, he would go to or read. Loves.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at his apartment, you see Pushkin, and I think Pushkin also influences his poetry, like the book Russia and Africa. So he's constantly thinking about, much like Pushkin, using poetry to think through these connections to Africa. But for James Lloydovich Patterson, it's not necessarily a direct connection to Africa, it's thinking through the connection of African Americanness. And so I think that's an important part is figuring out that identity, but also he says like we share a similar heritage, and I think it's very special to Mr. P that he shares a heritage with like Russia's most important writer and the father of Russian language. So I think that also leads to a better acceptance of that mixed race heritage. He grew up and he had a loving mother, and he had his siblings, but no one else around them looked like him, especially after his grandmother, Margaret, leaves the Soviet Union later in the 30s. So I think that helps him kind of work through this social and kind of cultural isolation until 57 when he meets other Africans at the festival. So I think that part of connection, that shared heritage, is an important part of his work because it helps him get through kind of that isolation that he finds. Him and other people like Elena Conga, who's also mixed race, have mentioned that isolation, but connecting to Pushkin to get through that.
And you'll be happy to know, Kimberly, that when Mr. Patterson moved to this wonderful nursing home, he has plenty of pictures of Pushkin in his own room, and I put tons of pictures up on his wall, so he is a very comfortable person there in his room. Yeah.
Very good. I have a question from Glenn Marcus from our audience who
Mhm.
wonders if either of you have any awareness of whether the FBI has a big file on Mr. P.
Well, I looked on our archives of the CIA and the FBI, and I couldn't find anything because I was just curious myself.
Sure.
But Kimberly, have you ever thought to look or?
The long-standing Freedom of Information
Yeah.
request that's still being processed. There hasn't been, I haven't seen anything on Mr. P, which makes sense. I mean, he wouldn't be in the American radar for the Cold War. His father left in the 30s and stayed and died in the Soviet Union, so there wouldn't be a lot on him, I don't believe.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting question. There's not a lot on some of the other African Americans who were part of the film group, like Levitt Fort Whiteman. He wasn't part of the film group per se. He was already living in the Soviet Union. He has an interesting FBI file, but there's not a lot. I think it just happens to be also, if you're African American in the 30s going to the Soviet Union, you're also competing with all the FBI work on the mafia. And so they're kind of they're splitting
Yeah.
a lot of workloads, but there hasn't been much. But it's also depends on if the Freedom of Information request gives me anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're at the end of the audience questions, and it's about time to wrap up. So I would like to give you both an opportunity to say just a few words in conclusion. And Kimberly, I'd like to start with you.
Well, I really want to thank everyone for being here and for, watching the film with us. I really have to just emphasize the magic that was meeting Mr. P a couple of years ago, and the true and it was magical, but also it meant so much to me as an African American student of Russian and Russian history. So it made it worth it to learn the genitive plural so I could speak in Russian with Mr. P. So hopefully we can continue to tell his story. And many thanks to Amy for doing all of this work and for meeting me at ACES after I gave a panel and saying, James Lloydovich Patterson is still alive and he lives in DC. So I owe this all to you. So thank you.
Oh, you're
Well,
welcome.
what better transition, Amy? We'd like to hear from you. And if you could tell us a bit about, I think the next airing of this film will be at the next ACES convention.
I hope so. Yes, I'm going to fill out the paperwork soon, and I think it would be a great place to show it to everybody. But for me, knowing Mr. Patterson brings me such joy. Whenever I see him, it is a wonder. And he asked me to tell you all that you are welcome to visit him anytime. He loves visitors and he loves chocolate. So if you do come and visit, and as I say, you are very welcome to, don't forget to bring the chocolate.
That's sage advice for any context, Amy.
Yes.
I want to thank Kimberly and Amy for participating in today's event and just a great video and a great look back and a great look at a great man who has just had such an interesting life. It really sort of throws a lot into a clearer context about what just the interactions between our societies, which don't interact and today don't really interact at all. So it's just wonderful to see this example of a time when such things were more possible and more welcome. I want to thank you both, and I want to thank our audience today. Please keep up to date with Kennan Institute events and publications from our website and our social media. And for those who want to visit Mr. Patterson or who would like to find out more about where to view this video, please just write to the Kennan Institute and we will connect you to Amy Ballard and I think she sells herself short. She's very much the producer of this film. Anyone who sits through garbage bags full of stuff in her apartment and sorts through it all and makes sense of it all and helps a Russian filmmaker make this amazing film is, by all accounts, the producer. So thank our audience once again, and with that, I will bring today's session to a close.